Hi, this is Jim Beers. I'm a retired U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service employee. I worked for them for 32 years. I went to work for them after working for the Utah Fish and Game Department while I went to college in Utah, getting a wildlife degree. And then I went in the Navy for 4 years and came out and went to work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as a wetlands biologist in North Dakota. And then I became a special agent or law enforcement officer for the federal government and was stationed in Minneapolis, Grand Island, Nebraska, New York City, and then in Washington, D.C. And after those experiences, I spent almost 30 years, some of it after I retired, still in the Washington, D.C. area. During that time, I was a wildlife biologist, chief of refuge operations, a program analyst, and a wildlife biologist over the excise taxes paid out to the state fish and game departments. During that period, I traveled to Europe numerous times and traveled around the country doing various jobs and wound up under the late Clinton administration being harassed and then driven out of the Fish and Wildlife Service really because of my activities on behalf of trapping and trappers in the United States and the state fish and wildlife agencies. The state fish and wildlife agencies are the ones that regulate trapping in the United States. But according to the Constitution, they're forbidden from working with foreign governments and conducting foreign affairs. The federal government does that. So I represented them for several years on a U.S. Trade Representative delegation and 2 State Department delegations to Europe to stop the European Union from closing down the fur market. Europe's the largest fur market in the world. The United States is the largest exporter of furs in the world, and number 2 is Canada, number 3 is Russia. So we worked together, the 3 of us, and what I found out during that time was the same animal rights and environmental groups that were causing a lot of chaos in Washington and in the United States with the introduction of wolves and a lot of endangered species abuses that were developing. A lot of them were over there lobbying, giving money to and everything, European bureaucrats in the European Parliament. And so it was a political battle, and I found out later that the director of the Fish and Wildlife Service was having secret meetings with these people late in the evenings and that, the environmentalists and the animal rights people, telling them that there was no reason to be worried about closing the fur market in Europe, which she wanted and which they wanted, but they didn't openly advocate because the fish and wildlife managers at that time were still trying to disguise themselves as the old line, we're in favor of the management of animals and the management of natural resources for people, instead of we're the advocates for the environment and people need to get out of the way, there are too many people, and you get all these other abuses that we've seen so vibrantly growing under the Clinton administration and the George W. Bush administration, but particularly the Obama administration. So with that in mind, when we were successful in getting the European Union to back down and change what they had been wanting to do and milking the lobbyists for in Europe, Fish and Wildlife Service got really mad at me and said they were going to transfer me to an unknown job, undescribed, in Boston, which is the end of the world for a guy like me. And I was old. I had 3 kids in college, had 2 daughters I was going to be marrying off. My wife was working 2 jobs. I was working an extra job to pay for that college. So they thought they had me pretty well forced that I would have to do what they wanted to. Well, it turns out they were terribly not only evil but stupid and blundering about browbeating me into retiring. And what it amounted to was that they did a lot of very illegal things to me, and I mean illegal like threatening to take away my pension, threatening to take away my health insurance if I did not do what they said and either retire or move up to Boston to just sit around and do nothing up there, which would have been economically devastating to me with the kids, my kids at the ages they were and everything. And my wife was worried about it all, and she knew that we couldn't afford to keep paying for most of their education and that. So I said no, I wasn't going to do it. And when I did that, they notified the police that they were going to try and fire me and that I was thought to be violent. Well, there was no reason in the world for that to be said. And the police at that time, I'm sure, looked up the fact that because my part-time job was an armed security job and I had numerous gun permits, that I could be a very dangerous fellow indeed. I didn't know all that took place until my wife called me one Sunday morning after she'd gotten the newspaper at home, and I was at one of my second jobs and doing armed security work, and that there was a notice put in my front door from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Nobody had knocked, nobody had rung the bell, and it had been about an hour and a half since she went out and got the paper, and it was in between the door and the screen, and in it there was an article, not an article, but a letter informing me that I could not go to my office without written authority and a guide at all times, and I could not take anything from my office. And the second one told me, actually it told a guy by the name, I believe it was Barnes, because they had, quite stupidly, copied an old letter that did what I'm about to tell you and left his name on there, I guess because it looked like Beers, Barnes, or whatever. But anyway, the letter, the other one said, Mr. Barnes, if you do not retire or agree to transfer to Boston by Thursday, that you will lose your health care coverage forever, and we will postpone your federal retirement pension, which I was way overqualified for in time and everything at that time, for 5 years. Well, my wife was just in mortal dread when I read these things. Well, I called a lawyer that I had engaged a little bit earlier, and he said, I can't believe that. Read those letters to me again. And I did, and he said, you stay home from work tomorrow, and he said, I will look into this and get back to you. And anyway, the next morning about 10:30, I'm at home, and I get a phone call from a fellow I worked with. And in a very whispered voice, he said, Jim, what did you do? I said, what do you mean? He said, there's police at the front door of the building, there's police down in the parking lot, they're checking everyone's photo IDs, which they did not do, and they were asking people if they had seen Beers. If Beers is in the building, they should notify the police. And I said, wow. I said, and I called my lawyer and told him, and he laughed and he said, I don't believe they did that. He said, all of this is illegal. They can't hold your pension back. They can't cancel your health care. And he said, they certainly can't have the police looking for you like this. He said, you just stay home until I get back to you. Well, the next day he called me back and he said, Mr. Beers, he said, they claim it's all a big mistake and they don't know who authorized it and blah, blah, blah. And he said, you're free to go back to work, but before you do, you should call a certain solicitor in the Interior Department, and that solicitor will explain all to you what's happened and send you back to work. And I said, okay. So I called the solicitor, and I was told he wasn't in his office, which I found hard to believe, but be that as it may, the next morning I called, asked for him, and was told he'll be with you in just a minute. I sat on the phone for 20 minutes. And he came on the phone after 20 minutes and said, hey, Mr. Beers, how you doing? And I thought to myself, why this cheery business here? This is a business thing. And I said, well, that's not really any of your concern. Well, you know, he says, no hard feelings, are there? And that was enough for me. And I said, hard feelings? I said, you've just told everybody in the building that I work with that I may be sticking up 7-Elevens or that I must beat my wife because the police are looking for me. And I said, you've threatened me and my wife with losing our health care coverage and my pension for 5 years. And I said, she's a nervous wreck. And I said, and you're asking me if there are any hard feelings about this? I said, honestly, I said, are you that stupid? And I said, there was a long pause, and then he said, well, Mr. Beers, he said, we'll get back to you. You just go ahead and go fishing till I get back to you. So I hung up the phone, called my lawyer, and he said, what did he say? And I told him that I should go fishing. And he said, well, you stay home from now on. He said, don't talk to anyone from the Fish and Wildlife Service. He said, I will handle everything from here on. Well, I wound up spending 10 months at home on full pay and salary, accruing annual leave, and wondering what's going to take place. So about 2 weeks into this little vacation I'm on, wondering what the future holds, I get a phone call from up on Capitol Hill from the House Resources Committee staff. And the House Resources Committee staff told me they heard that I had been sent home And they wondered what the circumstances were of that. And I started to explain about trapping in the European market and the animal rights and environmental lobbyists in the United States. And they asked if I could come up the next day and talk to some of their staff people, which I did. And in talking to them about this and explaining it, the subject came up. I brought it up because I really didn't know about it. I said, you know, something funny happened at the beginning of the Clinton administration. Now this was, I'm talking here in 1998, early 1999. I said, you know, when Clinton came in, everybody was afraid about gun control, and we had that big burst of gun purchases and ammunition purchases, which similarly happened at the beginning of the Obama administration. And I said, that should have caused a great big bubble and increase in the excise taxes that we got in the Fish and Wildlife Service for those first 2 years, which we get a year to a year and a half later from each of those years. And I said, the funny thing was, I said, I never saw an increase or bubble in it, the money that we sent out to the states. And he said, really? They said, why do you think that? I said, I honestly have no idea. I said, the Fish and Wildlife Service receives the money from Customs, and that we then take that money and distribute it out by a formula to the state fish and game departments. And we can only hold back a small amount of it, small percentage by law, for administration. So anyway, they thanked me for coming up and explaining my problem, said they were going to look into it. They were getting a big laugh out of this stuff about the solicitor and the threatening letters and all this stuff. Well, anyway, about 2 weeks later, they called me up again and they said, Mr. Beers, could you come up here the next day? And I said, sure. Because I'm sitting at home, I said, I'm on the government payroll. If you got something you want me to do, I'm glad to do it. So I go up there and they show me, take me into a little room, and they show me 19, about 2-foot high boxes of computer paper, the old computer paper that's all one sheet, all folded up with the punch holes along the side. And they said, do you know what that is? And I said, I have no idea. What do you mean? They said, that's all of the Fish and Wildlife Service's budget material for 1995 and 1996, which is when you would expect to see the pass-through of the federal aid money. Well, anyway, I said, why do you have all of that? I said, the Fish and Wildlife Service is one of the most complex agencies there is for funding. I said, they not only don't get audited like the other agencies don't get audited either. I said they get all kinds of money for research you can't use for law enforcement you can't use for refuges money that you can't use on fish hatcheries, and then you've got this mixture of regional offices and Washington office, area offices, and what this person does and that, and this person works for a hatchery so he can't really get endangered species money for some endangered owl or whatever. I said, it's very complex. And they said, yeah, we've gathered that already by looking at this. And I said, well, why do you have it all? They said, because we asked for all the federal aid or excise tax expenditures for that period of time, and they said they could not break it out. Well, I found out later it was a big joke in the Fish and Wildlife Service that they would just send them this stuff, and nobody up there on Capitol Hill would ever figure it all out or know what they were looking at. And I said, well, frankly, I said, that's a lie. I said, that's all on computer, and I said they could use certain codes and they could pull that out in a heartbeat. And I said, but do you want to try and get that from them? They said, no, we'd rather look through all of this. They said, could you help us? And I said, well, what do you mean? Could you go through all 19 boxes for us and see if there are things that you catch and I said, well, again, I'm home and I don't have anything scheduled for the next few weeks. I said, it might take me as much as a week or more. Well, it actually took 2 weeks. I said, but if you'll give me an office up here, a small spot, that I can have the door closed and work on these. And I said, give me a bunch of grease pencils and different kinds of pens with different colors and a lot of paper to write on. I'll go through there and mark things and make a note on the side of the computer paper, and as well as record what I'm looking at. And they said, thanks very much. Well, so I spent 2 weeks up there, traveling up there and finding a place to park on the street back in those days was tough. It's even tougher now. And eating in their cafeteria, which thankfully was cheaper than other cafeterias. Thank you, American taxpayers. But anyhow, I worked that out, and I told them that I saw a lot of money going to the endangered species program that was more than they were getting for endangered species from somewhere. and that there was large amounts of money being laundered somehow through the Public Affairs Office in Portland and sent down to California. And I said, I don't know what that's all about. And I said, and there's a lot of federal aid, excise tax money being put into some Washington office and regional office top managers' bonus money. And I said, these are people that don't handle that, and it's illegal for that to be used that way anyway in the Fish and Wildlife Service. And I said, for some reason, and I said, it's a lot of money. It's millions and millions of dollars. I said, I can't tell it all. And they said, well, thank you very much. And about 2 weeks later, I get a call from the General Accounting Office that they've been asked to do an audit of those 2 years, and they asked me to several little breakfast get-togethers with the auditors, and we would spend hours at breakfast going over, what does this mean, why is that, what do you mean by that? And I was explaining the way the money seemed to go. And what we finally determined was that the endangered species money was bled over into the effort to go up into Canada and trap wolves, import them back into the United States without any entry documents, and take them over to Yellowstone Park and hold them in pens there and do a lot of hoopla about what they were going to do and save the wolf and make the upper Rockies look like it did when Sacagawea walked across them. So anyway, the other money over in that was going through Portland was going down to open an office in California. Now, both the office in California and the introduction of wolves into the upper Rockies, the Fish and Wildlife Service had requested money for when Clinton first got into office. But two years after he got into office, the Republicans, for the first time in 40 years, took the House. So Congress denied authorizing or funding putting wolves in the upper Rockies, or opening an office in California where they could all get together and be cozy between the federal bureaucrats and all of the crazy environmental groups and animal rights radicals that were in California. So anyway, they had taken the money from the excise taxes over 2 years, the big bubble money, so it didn't look like anything much had gone, and it was around $60 million, and used over half of it for the wolf program and other things, and used about a third of it for this new office to get it established in Washington, and the rest of it was bled over into top managers' bonus money for the year, which are considerable under the way the federal employees are paid now, and it was paid to people who never had anything to do with the excise taxes, and by law could not have that money to begin with, nor could they get money from accounts that they didn't manage for their performance. But anyway, long story short, the Congress wanted to have hearings about that, and they scheduled hearings. And I was a witness along with the General Accounting Office, auditors, about the money that we had come across and everything. Now this is all while I was still officially sent home with no duties, and Congress has asked me to do this stuff. So anyway, we documented it all in 2 big hearings. They were packed hearings. You know, the money was stolen. It did things that Congress didn't want, wouldn't authorize, and opened the door, quite frankly, to what you see today, where the federal government has now developed precedents for the right to put any animal they want wherever they want, and to tell the state fish and game agencies, fish and wildlife agencies, that they are nothing but second-class citizens as far as the management of fish and wildlife in their state, because the federal government now has proven that they can put wolves wherever they want and tell you how many you must keep, even if they turn over management back to you, and what kind of ways you can manage them, and why they don't have to pay compensation if it kills your dog, but they say they'll do it if it kills your cow, but most of the time they'll say that, well, we're not sure what killed it. The whole thing is just a big scam, but they've established the precedents now to do that. But getting back to the story, after I testified the second time, the chairman of that House Resources Committee, Congressman Richard Pombo from California, a great man, and he had a lady on there that she got to be one of my heroes too, Helen Chenoweth from Idaho. They said that they wanted to see the director of the Fish and Wildlife Service the following week come up to a hearing. came time for the hearing, and I was asked to be there in case they wanted to call me up for any reason. So I'm sitting in the audience, and in walks the deputy director, some guy that nobody knew or heard about. And Congressman Pombo said, well, where's the director? Oh, he said, she got called to a meeting out in California, and she's out on the West Coast right now, but she's authorized me to come up. He said, I asked for her to be here. He went, bang. He said, this hearing is closed. If she isn't here next week on Tuesday or whatever day it was, he said, we will find her in contempt of Congress and issue a subpoena for her. Well, she was there the next week, and long story short, they asked her right out of the chute. They said, Madam Director, by what authority did you take this money that by law, $60 million, that by law could only be given to the state fish and wildlife agencies for their wildlife programs, and use it to do two things that we said you couldn't do? And her answer was, Mr. Chairman, she said, my solicitors had advised me that before that money was given out, I could use it any way I wanted because I had that authority. And at that time, I knew who she was, but I'd never really been involved with her anyway. Congresswoman Helen Chenoweth from Idaho goes, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman. And Pombo looks at her and he says, the chair recognizes the lady from Idaho. She says, Mr. Chairman, she said, I am so relieved to find that there's such a woman in government that can spend money however she wants. And I would like to remind her friends and our friends across the aisle, pointing over the Democrats that are there, that perhaps we should take this lady and let her fund the Star Wars program that where the opponents and many other people seem to oppose, since she can take money from anywhere and use it any way she wants, despite what the law says. Anyway, the place broke into laughter and all of this, and that was the end of that hearing. Well, I'm still at home with nothing to do, and the staff people on my way out told me, we're going to get that office closed in California. We've really got them on that. Oh. Well, anyway, the next day, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service took a special assistant to the regional director in Denver, who, by the way, happened to be the daughter of Senator Ted Stevens. She's passed away now. But they had hired her a couple of years before at a job fair in Chicago, which was meant for women and minority hires, at a high job grade. And she was hired at the grade I retired at, and then was given a higher grade and became a special assistant. Overnight, they made her the director or chief or whatever they called it of that office in California. And it was like you ran an electric wire into it as far as anybody going in there, because the Republicans would have been the ones that would have gone in there, but none of them wanted to anger Senator Stevens. So the Fish and Wildlife Service had gotten their money's worth out of having her, for whatever reason, hired. And anyway, time went on and nothing was being done. The presidential election was coming up, and I went up to see the state Fish and Game Director's lobbyist office in Washington, who I had worked with closely for years. A lot of respect for him and everything. And they told me that they were told by the Fish and Wildlife Service that it was all just accounting errors, that whatever. Clearly they had not received the money. And the truth is, when they didn't receive the money, that was $60 million of wildlife programs that guys like me and girls out there expected to be spent for fish and game management. Didn't get it. We didn't get our thing. And the state directors were not going to ask for the money to be replaced. I was stunned. I said, how can you do that? Well, they said, the Fish and Wildlife Service is telling us it's an accounting error, and our director of our lobby group, who, like goes on in Washington all the time, was the retired chief of the Forest Service. So you hire people like that because they've got influence and gravitas and all of this. But the truth is that they are all just the chief Charlie McCarthy's for whatever politician put them in there. And that's just a fact. I'm not complaining about it, but that's the system. So anyway, he had advised them, because they were going to have all this future stuff with endangered species, and hunting and fishing and trapping are on their way out, and you know, the federal government's going to be managing more and more stuff so they took his advice. So Nothing came of it. They didn't want to rock the boat with the presidential election coming up, and the state fish and game directors were afraid to ask for money that they had just heard a GAO audit say in a hearing in the House of Representatives halls that had been stolen from them. So the wolves stayed where, and they were already out by then, and the congressman knew that. You weren't going to pull them back in. And that office just grew into a new regional office out there on the West Coast. And I just gave a talk in Nevada recently, and I heard some horror stories about how environmentally radical and animal rights radical that office is over the people that are under them and everything, and their refuges and whatever. But be that as it may, I was still at home until I got a phone call from my lawyer, and he says, well, they want to settle with you. Now, this was 10 months after I was sent home. And I said, what does that mean? He said, well, they're going to give you a 6-figure thing. Come on over to my office, and we'll go over and talk to them later in the morning. So the next morning I go over there, and what I was informed of was this, and I think all Americans should pay attention to this when they pay out a settlement. They're using tax money to begin with. This is your tax money. And they offered me a 6-figure thing over a 3-year period. They give me one payment, 1/3 this year, 1/3 next year, and 1/3 the year before. But I had to sign a paper saying that I would not write or speak for 3 years about any circumstance or item covered in my separation from the government. So they actually use your money to silence me to public examination by the media or anyone. Oh, Mr. Beers, I think you were lying about the money that was there, and they didn't use that. That money was this. How did you know that? Never got done. So, they didn't do anything to the Fish and Wildlife Director, who, just as an example, was the same one that gave the Defenders of Wildlife, while she was director, authority over compensation payments for federal wolves that attack cattle and livestock. And for years, all you heard was complaints that, oh, they couldn't get out here in time. By the time we got there, it was all cleaned up, and they said it was other things. It was all a big scam. When she left the government, she went to work for the National Wildlife Federation for 2 years, and then lost her job there. But it was the kind of job where you got a big settlement for getting lost. And then she went to work, at the end of 3 years, she went to work for the Defenders of Wildlife, because for 3 years, she could not work with or deal with somebody she had dealt with in her position. And the guy who was in charge of the excise taxes at the time was the head of the Merchant Marine and Fisheries Committee staff when Gingrich and the Republicans came in. That had always duplicated the Resources Committee about things that the Forest Service was going to do, the Fish and Wildlife Service was going to do, NIMS was going to do about marine mammals and all that. It turned out to be a very green bunch. Well, the chief staff guy, when he lost his job, I think it was about 2 months into the Republicans taking over the thing, they did away with the committee. He lost his job. He popped up a week or two later in the Fish and Wildlife Service in a chop job in charge of the excise taxes. Now, when George W. Bush got elected, the woman had to resign because she was an appointee of Clinton's, and the new director was an appointee of George W. Bush. And what he did was take this guy who was in charge of the excise taxes and make him a sort of a non-position titled Science Advisor. Now, this is an agency theoretically all full of scientists, but he was a science advisor, and they gave him an office a few hallways down from the directorate quarter in the Interior Department, where he sat throughout the Bush years. And then when President Obama got elected, they appointed a new director who died shortly thereafter, a heart attack at a ski resort. Boom, and they turned around and they put that old science advisor, ex-Merchant Marine and Fisheries staff guy as director, and I told you that the director under Clinton went to work for the Defenders of Wildlife, a top job. The one under Bush, I think, went to the Wildlife Society or one of them. Well, the one that came in under Obama and has overseen a lot of the more recent abuses that you've seen with the Endangered Species Act, lead shot, and a whole bunch of other things, he walked out the door on January 20th to a big job with the Zoos and Aquarium lobby in Washington. So that sort of cycle keeps going. Well, when I signed the thing in late 1999 that I would retire and I got this settlement, I went home and I started doing a lot of other things, writing and that about stuff that wasn't to do with that. But when the 3 years were up, I went on a speaking circuit. I've spoken all over the country, from Florida to Washington State. I've talked to people about wolves, about grizzly bears. I've helped people in Florida stop the state and the federal government from making use of the Florida panther as a way to get rid of deer hunting down there and swamp buggies, while at the same time the federal government brought in pythons and allowed the people that brought those in to get loose, and now they got those problems down there. And the way the Audubon Society works with the state and federal government to claim that shorebird activity on barrier islands in Florida is a tool by which to close the beaches to people entirely, to get families off there, not have dogs on there. And at the same time, they won't do any predator work, and that's what really is the big limiting factor on those shorebirds. But anyhow, I've helped people like that. There's just a lot of things that I've gotten involved with, waterfowl concentrations in Nebraska and that. So I travel places and I do a lot of work in that regard, and I keep very busy. And I write a lot of articles about things you read in the paper or things you hear about. For instance, they just came out with new rules for these windmills, turbine windmills, that are killing birds. And they've killed millions of birds a year since that happened. They're sited where the wind is the greatest, and that's where the birds migrate. They run them at night and whatever. And the ones that are killed are quickly cleaned up once they start chopping up migrating birds. Skunks and raccoons and foxes and coyotes and birds of prey smell that. They come in there, they're cleaning it up all the time, and then when it stops, the migration stops, they scatter back out. So they've given out permits now to kill bald eagles. They really never did anything. Nobody was objecting, not the Audubon Society that was in tears about the shorebirds on the barrier islands and little baby shorebirds. You know, none of them, not the Fish and Wildlife Service that claims to protect all these animals. The Fish and Wildlife Service that, I mean, another thing that, I mean, just drives me nuts. They allowed Asian carp to be imported into the United States for catfish farmers to keep their ponds clean of scum. Well, the catfish farmers, especially in the southeast and lower Mississippi, are all in low areas where there's a lot of water, and that floods. So the idea that it would be a surprise to anybody that when it floods, whatever was in there would get out of the ponds is, you know, nuts. But they allowed them to bring in 4 different species of Asian carp to clean up those ponds. Well, they got loose and got out, and now they've absolutely cleaned out all of the other fish life in the Illinois River. They're coming up the Mississippi, and we've got to spend money, millions of dollars a year in Chicago to keep blocking from getting into the Great Lakes, and it's just a mess. And nobody says a word about the fact that the Fish and Wildlife Service has had the authority for 80 years to stop what they call injurious wildlife, like pythons, Asian carp and that, from even being imported. And we want to turn around and give these people even more authority, which I've testified against twice, for invasive species. They come out and they tell you that they want to stop the importation of killer bees and kudzu, which is already here as a developed plant. But they give you all of these horror stories about these plants and animals. And what they're really after, if they get that authority, is they're going to come out and they'll say, well, the brown trout is an invasive species, even though it's been here since colonial times, because they brought it here for whatever. The pheasant is an invasive species. The chukar is an invasive species, and they're going to want to try to get rid of them as just another way, like they use the sage grouse and like they use the wolves and the grizzly bear, to discourage hunting, make the ammunition more expensive, make it more dangerous to send your 12-year-old son out to use your deer stand out behind the place because there are grizzly bears and wolves in the area. You got kids now waiting in school bus stops that are cages down in Arizona and New Mexico because wolves hang around there seeing the kids to protect them, not only when they get dropped off, that they stay there until they get picked up to take home. So I mean, you've got all this dramatic stuff going on. People were lied to about what the wolves carry, diseases and infections. A lot of dangers. All of that was overlooked, while at the same time they will emphasize other disease problems, you know, as a reason to do this, that, or the other thing. While they grow and grow the federal authority, and the states become more and more really subcontractors, subsidiaries to the federal government's plans. And it seems to me that what's happening right now is sort of like the George W. Bush period was kind of a hiatus in this enormous march to having the federal government run everything in our lives, take property without compensation. And the whole thing involved around this, limit the number of people there are out there, and, you know, take away guns and all of this stuff. What we probably have got now is a little hiatus in that, and unless they make permanent changes in a lot of the authorities and the laws, like when when you wanted to be able to sell some liquor to responsible people again, they repealed prohibition. And that was a constitutional amendment. Well, nobody wants to touch the Endangered Species Act or the Wild Horse and Burro Act or the Wilderness Act, any of them. And all the harms that they're causing are just going to get worse when the next administration comes in that's sort of got all these other agendas in mind. So, yeah, as a result of my experience and whatever, I'm very committed with this. And I just read an article the other day that kind of explains why, I guess. I said I read about how the Europeans are not having children in addition to having this big Muslim migration in. And what that's going to mean in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. As a wildlife biologist, I can appreciate what happens when your calf production or, you know, young production goes down. You can kind of chart that out and say, well, you know, within 5 years this, then 15 years that. Well, anyway, the article said that not only was this going on, that they were not having children, but that the leaders of 6 of the countries in the EU are childless. Older men and women who are presidents and that, Angela Merkel, Theresa May, those kind of people. And that for the next day I read where Ireland was celebrating their first homosexual president appointment. Well, again, another childless person. And I got to thinking about that, and I thought, you know, I'm probably as wound up about these things as I am, not because I was mistreated by these people who have no moral values. I've got children and I've got grandchildren, and I look at them, especially the grandchildren, and I think to myself, what kind of world am I leaving you? Okay? You're going to be having to live in an apartment that they tell you got to be in. You can't own property. They're going to tell you what you got to eat. And you can't have a gun, but they're going to put dangerous wolves around you and dangerous grizzly bears around you and tell you you can't be armed, you know. And I said, I don't want the world to be like that. But I said, people who don't have children or grandchildren, they can tell you, oh, I think about that. Or it's not the same as looking at your kid, your grandkid, and saying, what's going to be like after I'm gone? So I'm wound up about that. I got into wildlife work because it's a vocation, and I thought this stuff was very important because it meant so much to me as a young man, and I wanted to preserve that and make it available to others. And for that, people like me are now marginalized and really spoken about terribly. But I'm proud to be doing what I'm doing, and I hope I'm an effective guy, you know, and do what I can as long as I can. I'm 76 right now, or going to be 76 pretty soon, and I'm just glad I got my health and, you know, keep plugging away. So anyhow, that's my story, and I hope I've you know, made a difference.